Welcome to the Innovation Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Innovaccer, the health cloud company. We're on a mission to connect and curate the world's healthcare information to make it accessible and useful. With Innovaccer, everyone works in the service of patients like never before as one. Visit us online at innovaccer.com.
Seth, I'm thrilled to have you here on the program today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for joining us. The discussion's inspired, of course, by the recent articles that you'd written in Forbes magazine on the EHR Is Dead, long live the EHR platform. And I have to say that when that came out, it went viral right away in our organization and really generated, I thought, some great conversation. So today's podcast is going to be a bit of a discovery into that article, and we'll dive in. But I thought it would be helpful to start with some just quick introductions. So I'm Sean Hogan, General Manager at Innovaccer, where I lead our provider practice. We are a business that's focused on health industry transformation. We're a technology-led company that focuses on data integration. And of course, your background gives you a real, I think the background, you can tell more about it, but CVS Caremark days of CVS Health, then SureScripts, several different strategy roles looking at different elements of the organization. So maybe you could just fill us in a bit.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Sean. And I'm really excited to be here. I'm finding that I'm quickly becoming just known as the guy who wrote the EHR Is Dead, long live the EHR Platform. That one seems to have resonated and met the intended outcome, which is to really stir dialogue and to prompt different conversation about the role of the EHR, the role of innovation, how partners can work together, et cetera. And so briefly, by way of background, you already did a wonderful job. Seth Joseph, I'm currently Managing Director of Summit Health, a boutique management consultancy and advisory, solely focused on healthcare, primarily working with digital health firms and really specializing in those that are bringing solutions that are network effects driven, platform business models to healthcare. I think there's tremendous opportunity there. And as you described, previously was with SureScripts, where I ran corporate strategy, and then prior to that, Caremark and CVS.
Yeah. So, well, great. I know when we first spoke, that kind of view of the industry and technology coming into the industry over the last couple of decades has been an interesting one that factored into this discussion. So, what is the premise in your mind that led you to? I mean, our country has invested tens of billions into the EHR platforms that now are in these systems. And I don't think you mean to say they're dead on arrival, but say more about what it's all about.
Well, yeah. So I'll talk a little bit maybe about what prompted me. In large part, it was. Having been now in healthcare and healthcare technology for 15 years, and as you described, we've seen the evolution, right? Both pre high tech and then the implementation of high tech and the EHR incentive program, meaningful use. Seen that program run through, and now we're in this post. It's not quite post. It's although it's no longer called meaningful use. The incentive program still has a role. The certification program still has a role, but really kind of observing changes over this course of time, I've gotten to see a fair number of things. And one of the things I'll say that really prompted me was in my time at SureScripts, I recognized that SureScripts was in a fairly unique role in the industry as a network. Along with EHRs, pharmacy, and PBM partners, SureScripts helped to stand up the first and truly ubiquitous form of interoperability in healthcare, e-prescribing. And people look at it now and take it as a given, but SureScripts was founded in 2001, became operational in 2003, and it took 6 years from there to when some initial federal financial incentives came into play that really drove physician and health system adoption of e-prescribing, and then another year before the Meaningful Use program really came into play. I think a lot of stakeholders, from policymakers to academics to providers to everybody in between, expected the rest of interoperability to come along a lot faster, and they've been frustrated. A lot of blame gets placed on the EHR, but they're in a really tough situation. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there, and I certainly don't claim to be an EHR expert of any sort, but I did think I had a point of view and wanted to stir the pot a bit, as I said.
Yeah, well, say more, because it is hard, right? And it's hard for a reason, because of what's involved in the data, what's at stake with the data. Maybe say a little bit more about those tensions in terms of, the expectations that it would just happen, and why it was hard, and sources of resistance that were real, or maybe, other considerations in play.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll try, and feel free to steer me in another direction, or ask me to back up. But I spoke with Glenn Tallman and Jonathan Bush, two incredible entrepreneurs who run today incredibly innovative companies in Transcarent and Zeus Health. But of course, they were previously CEOs of Allscripts and Athena Health, respectively, as part of the research for this article. And I thought Glenn put it really well. He said, look, EHRs were built for coding and billing. And then I think a couple of things happened. There was, in general, bipartisan consensus at the time that healthcare operating in a paper-based world was highly, highly suboptimal. It was suboptimal in terms of care coordination, in terms of communication, in terms of information flow between providers and each other, providers and payers, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of duplication of procedures. There was inefficiency all over the place. The Rand Corporation did a study suggesting that getting the system digitized could save, it's in the article, I believe it's around $80 billion a year. And to be honest, they probably undersold it a bit. But that
series, I think, characterized roughly 30% of the total health system being what they characterize as waste, right? And yes, that can be, in that umbrella, is a few things like you described, the redundancy or erroneous or whatever. That's a big, big number, and that's often cited. And I think it's kind of interesting because it often draws folks into it and saying, wow, we can just show up and we'll fix it all and make it magically more efficient. And it's not so easy.
It's not as easy as saying it. I think you're right. But, and I think what happened was there was this emerging thesis that getting the system digitized and connected could yield tremendous benefits. And then what that really coincided with was, I think, just political circumstance, which was we had just entered into the financial crisis of 2008. There was a presidential election, and I think the incoming administration was looking to identify shovel-ready infrastructure projects that the federal investment could invest in and start putting money out into the economy to help the economy recover. And one of those projects was, hey, there's this RAND study out there. There's all these benefits that can happen if we get doctors, hospitals, et cetera, to adopt EHRs. Made a lot of sense.
Totally.
You can't get the system connected if they don't have a system in place.
Right.
And so conceptually makes a lot of sense. As it turns out, implementation was a little bit more difficult.
Well, and I think you described in the article, you really described, I think, an interesting aspect of how that evolved with the notion of meaningful use and, the intent of that, and then how that translated into what it led the the software companies, the EHRs, to have to do to comply. So maybe put a little bit more
Sure.
background on that. Yeah.
So I remember being at SureScripts in 2010, 2011, talking with stakeholders throughout the industry. And in general, I'm sure there were different aspects of people pushing back against some of the requirements. But what I remember in particular was somebody at the time, a real industry insider, very knowledgeable, incredibly sharp, who'd been around a long time, and said, look, the way they've staged this, stage 1, meaningful use, stage 2, stage 3, with gradually incremental and building requirements, both for not just adoption, but use of different functionality and then different components of interoperability. The term I recall was, it's incredibly elegant. And indeed, it was incredibly elegant. And I don't know that anybody, even in retrospect, could have designed a system that was more elegant, well-intended, or ultimately that would have done much better. But as it turns out, prescribing interoperability is really hard, because I think interoperability is so many different things to different constituents.
Right. And so what I also remember is, because they had to fulfill those requirements, it kind of led to the companies that had the resources were the ones that were able to fulfill those requirements.
Absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely right. So the meaningful use program required, I've got it in the article. I don't have the article up in front of me, but it's a total of 58 different requirements across clinical, across public health reporting, across patient engagement and making information available. So all of these different requirements, and what that required EHRs to do, or the conditions that set forth for the market, was it created a set of conditions in which every EHR realized, oh my goodness, we know what our product roadmap is for the next 3, 5, 6 years. We've got to invest massively in developing this functionality. We've got to go from coding and billing to every different clinical area under the sun, meet these 57 different requirements, and we've got to be the first to knock on a provider's door or a health system's door. We've got to give the CIO confidence that we can help them meet meaningful use. Because I think on the provider side, certainly on the acute side, I think every organization saw the writing on the wall. They understood this is being backed by Medicaid and Medicare, two of the largest payers. We're going to be required to do this. We might as well take advantage of the money. And so what they wanted was, they wanted a vendor that could make it easy. And Sean, I think you put it really well. What that meant was, well, what's the saying? Nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Well, I think that, similarly, they looked at the largest EHR vendors out there, in particular, those who, had the capabilities and could give them confidence. And it resulted in, a rather difficult relationship on both sides, and a really difficult business to be in for the EHR.
Well, but one big goal, just adoption, which the industry had been wrestling with for decades. Wow, that was, so we quickly got to 90% EMR adoption across the industry, and now the industry is no longer paper; it's digital, right? And that's in the things that Glenn was describing there in place. They're really foundational for the possibilities of innovation on that foundation. That's kind of the notion? Or?
Absolutely. And we shouldn't diminish. I think you're right. That the progress that we've made is amazing. I recall, EHR adoption was maybe 5% or so back in 2008, 2009. And we've gone from that. And I think every expectation was it might grow, but it's going to grow, single digits a year. So, by 2021, we might be at 25%, who knows? And this absolutely spurred adoption of the EHR. And as you said, now we're at 90% adoption. And kudos to the federal government for being such good planners that nobody held up a mission accomplished banner, when we passed 50% adoption. So I think everybody realizes we're not quite there yet, but it's a huge accomplishment to have gone from under 10% adoption to over 90%. And I do think it's fair to say, while there's a lot of disappointment in the EHRs themselves, that's also laid the groundwork for an enormous amount of investment and some really innovative things happening around the EHRs.
Yeah, like anything that, the balance of what expectations are versus realities that we experience, that was certainly one of the difficult challenges, because I think there was a view of, we would have all of this liquidity of information. We would use computers and technology to make things so much more efficient. And among the things that has certainly been a stress factor for the industry is the amount of administrative burden on the physician community. And so that's something we're dealing with. Another part of the article that caught my imagination, intrigued me, were some of the visuals. And you mentioned, so I'll flash a couple on my screen now, and with this bluish feet and the body tag on it. That certainly was provocative. The part that without even seeing the visual, that caught my imagination were the stories, the reference that you had to Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel. And I grew up outside of Boston, where the story kind of took place, and these diagrams, these charcoal pictures of Mike Mulligan and Anne Marie, and maybe share a little bit of the story as from the conversation that you had with Jonathan Bush, and what the relevance is to this topic.
Full credit goes to Jonathan for this metaphor. When he said it, it was amazing. And as soon as he said it, what struck me was, oh my goodness, I remember that book. I remember being read that book as a child. And yes. I have that book upstairs, and I've read it to my kids.
Me too. It's a great story.
It is, and as you know, it's so fitting. So Jonathan basically compared, and he was, he I think was specifically speaking to Judy Faulkner and Epic, and drawing the metaphor there. And for those who don't know, the story of Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel is one of really hard worker with dated technology, a steam shovel, facing competition from newer, more capable alternatives, electric and gasoline shovels. Mike makes a bet that he can do a really big job in a day, but it's more than he or his steam shovel can take on. In an effort to prove himself, he winds up digging so furiously and fast that he doesn't realize that he's left himself no way out. The story, in this case, ends happily when he repurposes the steam shovel to a furnace. And so I think it's funny in two respects for me. One, the visual is amazing, right? Jonathan rightly sees most EHRs, and Judy Faulkner and Epic in particular, as just, digging away furiously without realizing or being aware that they're digging themselves a hole they can't get out of. And the part, I suppose, that really resonated with me, or the reason it stuck with me, and I really, enjoyed including it in the article, is because aside from the hilarious picture, I think the metaphor is really quite accurate. I don't know that there's a way out, whether it's Judy Faulkner and Epic or some of the other EHRs, in terms of their current business model. But in fact, Sean, as you know, it's not that Mike Mulligan's steam furnace, what is it, Marianne, rusts or dies away. It's repurposed. And so I think if we think about repurposing the EHR, or if EHRs are aware or their management teams are aware of what they've gotten themselves into and realize, well, we can't just keep digging. Then
let's come back to that in just a sec, because I, having experienced and worked with Epic and the whole, it's an incredible organization, and what they produced and delivered to the industry is truly admirable. Same with what Neil did for CERN, built an amazing
Absolutely.
business. They were way ahead of where anybody else was. And when the circumstances arrived, they really executed and delivered. And I think this is where, the contrast, the tension, and I felt that in some of my prior work experiences, that a business model of an organization, like a functional design of a steam shovel, has some parameters, some design, and a purpose, and it can somehow be hard to can you rebuild something to be something entirely isn't, or find a way to leverage the incredibly important foundational capability or whatever it has in place. And that I think is part of the fun story of the the redemption, if you will, is that there's a role. And so, as much as that, so I want to, let's hear some more about that. And then what I'd love to turn some of the conversation to is, we're a business who focuses on serving provider organizations. Yes. And they are the ones who have invested heavily in having this foundation. And so very interested in your thoughts and perspective. Well, what do they do? Because they've invested in having the furnace, the engine, and there's incredible pressure to innovate. So
absolutely. And I'd like to, I guess, take a step back and just say, hopefully what comes across in the article is yes, a bit of provocation and silly metaphors, but to give Epic and Judy Faulkner full credit, what they've done is amazing, and nothing should be taken away. I think that they've done unbelievable things. She's built this incredible organization, and in many respects, we couldn't
do what we do without organizations
absolutely.
Like them being in place.
They've laid this infrastructure that supports, whatever it is, 30%, 50% of the healthcare system, hugely admirable, and yet also limiting. And so let's talk about it for a moment from the provider perspective. You mentioned that providers have invested in the EHRs, and I think that is true to an extent. I also think it's fair to say it is largely administrators who invested in EHRs, and that the EHR is largely for the health system or the practice. I have yet to meet terribly many doctors who love their EHR because it wasn't purpose-built with them in mind. And by the way, how could it possibly be? How can you purpose-build a piece of software for a primary care physician, for a rheumatologist, for a cardiologist, for a nephrologist, we could go down the list, but it would be hard for any one organization to purpose-build workflows, software, UI that meets any one of those, much less all of their needs. And yet that's what the Meaningful Use program required. It required safety in, well, we need this, so let's get it installed. And I think the shame of it is that EHRs may be meeting organizational needs, but not provider needs. And that's right, where I see a lot of opportunity.
Well, and what else is interesting too, at the time of high tech and ARA, the drive was to get use the stimulus to get the adoption. There was also the background of health reform promoting value-based care and a shift from fee-for-service models. The reality is that when that program was being deployed, we were still almost entirely a fee-for-service system. And so serving that purpose, I think, a foundation of being able to process, do the administration, do the billing, that's absolutely essential. And now what we certainly feel is, and this is perhaps propelled by what we've experienced through COVID, in this shift to value-based care and outcomes, is a mandate to have the fluidity of data and innovation to keep up with this pace of change. And I'm curious if that's how you see that dynamic playing out.
Absolutely. I think it's a great point. The value of EHRs for billing and coding, that's not a bad place to begin. And in fact, you make a great point. EHRs and the Meaningful Use Incentive Program, the EHR Incentive Program and Meaningful Use came about in a time in which providers were predominantly paid on a fee-for-service basis. And in fact, I think the federal government largely viewed the investment in EHRs as laying the technology infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, to facilitate a shift to value-based reimbursement system, to true population health management, to focusing on wellness rather than sickness.
Right.
And yet the EHRs and providers have had to kind of or I should pause and say, the EHRs have been caught similarly as providers have largely been caught, in which they grew up in a fee-for-service world. I'm trying to recall what the numbers are, but I think that 85 to 90% of all payments today are still predominantly fee-for-service. And yet we're shifting. We all know where the future is going. But until we reach that critical mass point, the business imperative operationally day-to-day for most provider groups and their EHRs, or what they demand of EHRs, is still largely going to be on billing and coding.
Right.
And yet, as you're pointing out, we know the future. It's coming. The health conference you and I were both just at, I think, was entitled "Dear Future, We're Coming for You." There's been 20, I think, what was it? 2020 was a record year in terms of investment in digital health at $14 billion. And we passed that in the first 2 quarters of 2021 alone. So there's tremendous investor and outside enthusiasm for this shift to value-based care. And we're seeing that in the form of all of this investment and all of the innovation that's happening around the EHRs. And we're seeing a lot of success, by the way. We're seeing exits, successful exits. We're seeing well-funded companies. We're seeing novel forms of primary care in the form of Oak Street Health and Carbon Health and Crossover. So all of this innovation is occurring, and it's occurring along a spectrum that is increasingly shifting towards value-based care. And there's so much technology supporting it. But the EHRs are supporting legacy provider systems that are still straddling. And that makes it hard for them. And so I think, as we've both been talking, this isn't a matter of trying to demonize the EHR. It's a matter of recognizing the situation that they're in.
Right. And it's, I think many of the recipients of this investment that you just referenced, some of them are fairly disruptive in their business models in terms of stepping into the industry and maybe doing the kind of predicated on the kind of impact that, say, Uber and Lyft have had in the transportation business. And maybe just share an example of one of those. And then let's also chat a little bit about big tech, because big tech has had some mixed results in the industry. So do you have a favorite example of a company that you see that's doing some innovative change in the business?
Well, sure. Since you mentioned Uber, not to suggest that this is an Uber-like at all, but I see tremendous opportunities for platforms, for true platform business model companies that view their role as fundamentally network effects driven, trying to connect different groups of users and bring them together on a common platform. One of those is Alidade. I think they're doing really interesting things. And in fact, funny enough, they're not bringing an entirely new model themselves. They're trying to bring platform technology to help independent primary care practices stay independent and arm them with technology, analytics, and services to do so, and allow them to contract with health plans, with insurers in ACO arrangements. And so Alidade is, this platform bringing together independent primary care practices and payers and helping them facilitate new arrangements. And I think that's fascinating. I imagine it's a very difficult business, so I don't want to suggest that this is easy,
Right.
but I think it's entirely worth doing. Another example, just this morning, the morning we recorded this, Oak Street Health, which is a primary care provider and a direct contract model with Medicare, acquired Rubicon MD. Rubicon MD is a platform that helps primary care physicians receive expert consults from a network of specialists. I think Rubicon is a great example because I know that they also are a partner of Innovaccer, and I think Innovaccer is doing some really novel things. So you're right, we're seeing innovation all over the place. I think it's an incredibly exciting time.
It is, and so yes, that pace of innovation and how different players are coming together in the pursuit of value to the people who they're providing care for, and at one level, it's encouraging for what it means to the health consumer, because it has not been an easy industry to navigate. You kind of encounter healthcare historically at the convenience of healthcare being made available to you in some respects. And the models that you referenced aren't the big asset intensive aspects of the health systems, which is really the makeup of the business of the provider systems. I mentioned big tech, because big tech has certainly been attracted to. Now this is an industry that's spending in technology in ways that it hadn't been spending historically. But it hasn't been easy for some of the big tech companies. And have you been thinking about why that might be, or some of the patterns that you've seen among those that have made efforts to attack the business?
Wow. Feels like we're entering minefield territory here. There are lots of people with really strong views one way or the other on this. So I think factually, you're absolutely right that there have been lots of attempts by big tech to enter into healthcare, and lots of enthusiasm around bringing an outsider's perspective and a technology first perspective into healthcare. I guess I'll just make a couple of comments on this one, because I think it is a charged topic, and I think that there are really experts out there who have a great perspective. Just a couple of things. So one, I think it's really easy to look from the outside in, recognize the dysfunction and say, this is broken. Nobody in healthcare really knows what they're doing. We know how to run a technology company. We know how to remove inefficiencies. We know how to remove friction from a process. And we can do this in healthcare. And one of the challenges, it's not just all of the entrenched interests and the size of organizations that in reality anybody's going to have to deal with in terms of payers and PBMs and pharmacies and provider groups, health systems, etc. It's that at least I have a healthy dose of respect for, as I understand it, because I've never been through medical school, but one of the first things you learn, right? The Hippocratic Oath, do no harm.
Yep.
And so you can't bring a let's move fast and break things mentality when there are frontline providers caring for patients. You need to be
And making
respectful.
life factory decisions. It's not
Yes.
like the color of whatever the gown that you're going to purchase or
Yeah,
the taste
we're
of the.
we're not doing A/B tests on whether the checkout box is more effective in the upper right or the upper left corner. These are real world decisions. They can be life and death decisions.
Yeah.
And so I think that, virtually everybody I've met in healthcare, in big tech, who comes in has positive intent. So I don't think that there's any ill intent or the assumption that necessarily that, although I just said it, people in healthcare don't really know what they're doing. I think there's just an assumption that this must be better. There are ways to improve, and there are absolutely ways to improve. And yet, one of the challenges is that figuring out the motions of a go-to-market in healthcare, figuring out what your model is, what your value props are, who they will resonate with. This all requires, one, knowledge of the healthcare system, knowledge of who you're working with, and two, it requires iteration. So this requires a level of patience that I think can be hard for publicly traded companies whose shareholders at the end of the day are concerned with next quarter earnings. And I don't mean to just gloss over or make light of this or oversimplify it, but it is real and fair to say that at some point, even for the largest technology firms, at some point, there will be questions about when the return is going to occur. And that creates pressure. And so I think there are some firms who have done a good job and have been patient and are really entering with, I think, a level of humility. And we've certainly seen some others. And look, I think I heard somebody say it really well. We should all be rooting for big tech to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I liked your well, first, that your comments align back to the analogy we talked about earlier with the business designs of company play a factor in how well they're able to play, how deep they can go in a topic, and how they can sustain a level of focus. I like the choice of your word, humility. That's something that I've always said that about the healthcare industry. If you don't have a level of humility, it will make you humble, or you'll find humility in this industry if you don't have it. One of the things that I think you pointed to that is a source of hope were some of the regulatory changes that are now playing into effect around requirements for data sharing. Could you say more a little bit about that and what you think it means for our listeners?
So we talked earlier about the Meaningful Use Program, successful at driving adoption, not so much interoperability. And I think interoperability, as we've talked about, can mean different things to different people. One of the things I'm really encouraged by with the 21st Century Cures Act and the Office of the National Coordinator's rules that have being implemented just this year relate to two things, and there are probably more than two. I'm sure I'm missing something, but a couple of things, especially as they relate to EHRs. So one, the way information blocking is defined is, although there's lots of language, I don't recall how long the rule itself is, the final rule, and the 8 exceptions that are provided, there's some level of vagueness. And what I'm encouraged by is that there is some level of vagueness. And in fact, the information blocking speaks to not just, doesn't prescribe just a set of requirements that EHRs must adhere to, although there are those, and so that's positive. They're being required to open up and expose APIs in a standard format using fast healthcare interoperability resources, the US core data interface set, I think, USCDI. And all of that's a good thing, and it will progress. So right now they're being required to open up to allow others to have read access. Eventually, hopefully that turns into write access. But also that information blocking is not that narrowly defined, in that the spirit of information blocking includes a set of activities that I think most of us from the outside looking in would agree are philosophically opposed to free flow of information. We know, I think Congress, there's been testimonials in front of Congress about the types of practices that some EHRs have engaged in. And again, I'm not seeking to assign any ill intent. If I were working at some of the EHRs, I think some of their practices are rational, if not excusable, but they may have made sense at the time, but they're counterproductive to making healthcare better and more open. EHRs should share in the upside of innovation that can happen on top of the EHR. They should absolutely have sustainable models, but I'm encouraged that these rules and regulations are going to foster a sense of, or should foster innovation, I should say. Now, interestingly, that was one of my contributing reasons to suggesting that the EHR is dead, but there's also opportunity, I think, for them to embrace this, in fact, and really take a hard look at what business they are in, and as you've characterized it, the design of their business. Philosophically, what they're going to do and how they're going to make money and support their clients. And I'm an optimist, so I think there's a great opportunity for them.
No, I hear that in your comments. And, it's the tension for many of our clients has been real. On the one hand, the desire to, to liberate the data to support the possibilities of innovation and engaging with your patient as a customer and consumer. But then there are real penalties and liabilities associated with any breach or misappropriate use or leaking of that information. So those tensions are definitely real. I think of some of the customers who we're working with, they're making choices on a day-to-day basis about the kinds of companies that they will work with and what they should expect from them. And that often is a topic of a conversation that we're having with those organizations, because the notion of partnering in this period of really rapid change, I think, is an important capability that many organizations need to do well. And have you seen either examples or thoughts on maybe how, and I'm particularly thinking of provider systems, might think of the calibration of criteria that they should be using and how they would look at companies for their sustainability, their flexibility, how well they get the challenges that them as a client face. So that would be really helpful advice or thoughts.
You're putting me on the spot here. It's really easy to write about a game and say pass interference definitely occurred. It's much more difficult to be, asked to be the referee and call it when it's happening. No, it's a good question. So a couple of thoughts. I think it's worth asking lots of questions of whether it's your EHR or another technology partner, asking them about their business philosophy, how they make money, where they choose to partner and why, whether they do have an ecosystem approach, and if, quite frankly, ask for documentation. Do they have, can they support that? Do they have, what does their library of APIs look like? Are they taking a modern architecture and a modern business approach to how they go to market and how they partner with organizations? Or is it much more siloed and a pipeline sort of mentality of being a software organization that tries to solve all problems? And so one question to ask would be, or to a set of questions would be, ask them about wide variety of different solution areas. And, if the answer is always, oh, we've got an answer for that, well, that might not be the best response. On the other hand, if they say, this is what we're really good at, we have a couple of other areas, and we can't be all things to all people, so we pursue very much a partnership model, and we have an ecosystem. Here's our library of APIs and how we partner with organizations, and by the way, we can show you who we partner with. And if we don't, if none of them have the solutions you're looking for, we're happy to work with you to go out and find a partner. That seems like some suggestions. And the final piece I should add is, for sure, bring the technology group in, because they'll be able to vet these in ways that certainly from the business side, I imagine either you nor I necessarily could.
Right. Well, appreciate your taking my question on the spot, and those are some really great suggestions. I'll, as we wrap up here, offer any final comments. I'll pick up on your comment earlier that you're an optimist. It has been an incredibly challenging year on so many levels, because what everyone has experienced, and I think particularly for healthcare providers, they're on the front lines dealing with the realities of the pandemic, the pressures that their businesses are under, and having an expectation of doing things and moving fast and making life decisions, not necessarily with the engine and structure of support behind them. And it's really been amazing to see the level of dedication and accomplishment that they've made as they've been doing so. And you've often highlighted some of the things too that you are optimistic about. And so maybe we can wrap up with any thoughts of yours on how you see the sense of progress that's being made through this.
Well, I certainly am an optimist. I like to think that that's not just by nature, but we have a choice, right? We can choose to focus on some of the negatives and the challenges, or we can acknowledge what those are and also turn to how we solve for those. And I agree with you. So the past 18 months or so have been incredibly challenging, and I don't have the words to describe all of the thanks and gratitude I think we should all feel and have for our frontline healthcare delivery organizations, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, et cetera. And quite frankly, the researchers, public health, and also the pharmaceutical organizations that brought tremendous life-saving vaccines to market in record time. I think that we have these outdated legacy systems. I'm not suggesting that they are going to change overnight. I do think that there are incredibly innovative solutions that are coming to market. We're on this path from fee-for-service to value-based care. Everybody knows where the world is going. Some are going to get there faster. And whether it's the EHRs as a whole who transform and rethink about the business they are in, or a few of them that do so quickly and succeed and have great success because of that, or just over time, the role of the EHR and the centrality of the EHR continues to get diminished, and providers and patients in particular are able to access purpose-built technology solutions that are designed for and meant for their benefit, that are able to plug back in, work seamlessly with the EHR. I think we are getting there. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there. You're hearing optimism.
I'm with you on those points. And, I think we've known or sensed that there may be imbalances or inequities associated with how well our health system supports the needs of our populations. We got to see that in a level of detail now that is inspiring, with now the visibility and transparency into those things, inspiring companies to respond. And we're seeing companies do good things and doing good service and having it be commercially successful as well. And that will hopefully provide opportunities to accelerate the closure of some of these gaps. Well, Seth, I love the conversations whenever we get a chance. So I suspect that this is going to be a to be continued dialogue, and we'll look forward to it. So thank you very much for spending some time with us today.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Sean, and the Innovaccer team.
All right, signing off, guys. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Innovation Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Innovaccer, the health cloud company. Don't forget to check the show notes for links to related resources and other information. And stay tuned to the Innovation Accelerator podcast for more programs about the healthcare IT topics you care about. Accelerate your transformation and build the future of health on the Innovaccer Health Cloud. For more information, please visit innovaccer.com.